I have cause. 3 words. Clear and cutting as a well-honed blade. They sliced through the hushed silence of the church, freezing the blood in Everett Hayes's veins as the strange woman beside him, his almost bride, lifted her veil with deliberate fingers. For 17 years, no one in Whitebrook had seen Alice Grant's face. They'd whispered she was disfigured, simple-minded, or wild beyond taming. They were wrong. The eyes that met his burned with intelligence sharp as winter stars, her lips curved in what might have been amusement. This was no trembling, sheltered creature. This was a woman with secrets. And Everett, the desperate rancher with more debt than cattle, had just realized too late that saving his land might cost far more than he bargained for. 3 months earlier, he'd stood in Sheriff Grant's office, rough hands clasped behind his back, pride bleeding out like a gutted steer as he accepted the devil's bargain, marry the sheriff's hidden daughter, receive enough money to save his ancestral ranch from foreclosure. Simple. Straightforward. Until it wasn't. A gust of wind rattled the window panes of his cabin, sending a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. The ranch house had never felt so empty, its familiar creaks and groans now seeming to mock his solitude on this final night of bachelorhood. The faded photographs of his parents and grandparents washed from the mantelpiece, generations of Hayes men and women who had worked this land, built it from nothing, loved it more than their own comfort. None of them had married for convenience. None of them had stood where he now stood, preparing to bind themselves to a stranger for the sake of survival. 3 months earlier, he would have laughed at the notion. A bachelor of 36 years, married to the land more than any prospect of family. His hands bore the scars of 2 decades of ranching, rope burns, the jagged reminder of a broken fence post, the smooth calluses from rains held through countless Montana winters. These hands knew cattle and horses, knew the weight of work and responsibility. They did not know the gentle touch of holding a woman's hand and promise. They would learn tomorrow. Desperation had carved new paths in his life. The drought had withered his cattle herd to half its former strength, leaving those that remained thin-flanked and dull-eyed. The banknotes had piled high on his desk, each one stamped with increasingly urgent red lettering. 5 generations of Hayes' blood soaked into the soil, and it would be his name that lost it all. The thought burned worse than any physical pain he'd endured. And then Sheriff William Grant's proposition had arrived like the answer to a prayer he'd never uttered. My Alice needs a husband, Hayes. Someone solid. Someone who won't ask too many questions. The sheriff had leaned forward across his office desk, his voice lowered despite them being alone, his silver-streaked black hair catching the lamplight. His badge gleamed on his chest, a symbol of the power he wielded in Whitebrook with unquestioned authority for the past 20 years. You need money to save that ranch of yours. I have it. The arrangement benefits us both. The sheriff had never allowed his daughter to be seen in town. Some whispered she was simple-minded, touched in the head since childhood. Others claimed she was hideously disfigured from some childhood accident, a fire, perhaps, or a fall from a horse. The more malicious gossip suggested darker reasons, spinning tales of wild behavior that needed to be contained, of a temperament unsuitable for polite society. In 17 years, no one in Whitebrook had laid eyes on Alice Grant beyond fleeting glimpses of a slender figure at the sheriff's remote homestead on the outskirts of the county. She was a ghost story, a rumor, a mystery wrapped in speculation and fear. The sheriff spoke little of her, answering questions with a cold stare that discouraged further inquiry. Those who pressed too far found themselves facing trumped-up charges or unexpected tax audits. And tomorrow, she would be Everett's wife. A sharp knock jarred him from his thoughts. His oldest friend, Daniel Wilson, stood in the doorway, a bottle of whiskey dangling from his fingers, hat still on his head as if he might need to make a quick escape. The lamplight caught in his red beard, making it look like smoldering embers. Last night of freedom, Daniel said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Care to make the most of it? Everett abandoned the tie, leaving it hanging loose and defeated around his neck. Pour, he said, gesturing to the glasses on the sideboard, remnants of his father's more prosperous days. Daniel crossed the worn floorboards, his boots leaving dusty prints in their wake. He poured 2 generous measures, the amber liquid catching the light as it flowed. To bad decisions, he said, raising his glass. Everett shot him a look, but clinked glasses anyway. To survival. The whiskey burned, a welcome distraction from the knot of uncertainty tightening in his gut. Daniel settled into the worn chair by the window, studying him with unconcealed concern, the way he might watch a horse showing signs of colic. You can still back out, you know. There are other ways to save the ranch. Everett swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching it catch the fading light. Name one. Daniel's silence was answer enough. They both knew the reality: the bank would foreclose within a month without the sheriff's money. 200 acres of prime Montana grazing land, the cabin his grandfather had built with his own hands, the stream that never ran dry even in the worst droughts, all of it would be auctioned off to the highest bidder. Likely the Harrington outfit from the next county over. They had been eyeing the Hayes water rights for years. "I just don't understand it," Daniel finally said, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "What does Grant get from this? Why hide his daughter away for nearly 2 decades only to marry her off to a rancher on the brink of bankruptcy?" The question had haunted Everett's sleep for weeks. The sheriff was a calculating man, known for his iron grip on the town and his uncanny ability to turn every situation to his advantage. There had to be more than fatherly concern behind the arrangement. "Maybe he's just a father trying to secure his daughter's future," Everett offered without conviction. Daniel snorted. "Grant doesn't do anything that doesn't benefit Grant. You know that as well as anyone." It was true. When Everett's father had served on the town council, he'd come home many nights cursing the sheriff's name, describing how Grant had manipulated votes, secured contracts for friends, quietly acquired property through tax seizures. Nothing could ever be proven. The sheriff was too careful for that. But everyone knew. They simply accepted it as the cost of the relative peace and prosperity Whitebrook enjoyed under his watch. "I'll find out soon enough," Everett murmured, draining his glass. "Tomorrow, I meet her for the first time." At the altar, Daniel poured another measure, his expression troubled. "That's the part one can't stomach. What kind of man marries off his daughter to a stranger she's never even met?" "The kind who keeps her locked away for 17 years, Everett replied, the whiskey loosening his tongue. "Whatever her situation is, Daniel, it can't be worse with me. I may not be much, but I've never locked anyone in a room." "Noble of you," Daniel said with a wry smile. But nobility doesn't answer the question of what Grant expects to gain. The fire in the hearth cracked, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, an owl called into the gathering darkness, its mournful cry seeming to echo Everett's own uncertainty. "The terms are clear enough," Everett said. "I marry Alice, Grant pays off my loans and provides operating capital for the ranch. In return, Alice lives here, and I provide for her." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And if she's everything the rumors suggest? Simple-minded or disfigured or wild?" Everett's jaw tightened. "Then she'll have a home where she's treated with dignity. Whatever else happens. And if Grant's true purpose is something else entirely? If this is just another of his schemes?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Everett had considered this possibility more times than he cared to admit. The Hayes Ranch was struggling, yes, but its location was strategic, controlling not just water rights but also the main pass into the next valley, where rumors of a railway spur had been circulating. "Then I'll deal with that when it comes," Everett said finally. "One thing at a time. First, the wedding. Then the truth." Daniel nodded slowly, knowing his friend well enough to recognize the stubborn set of his jaw. "Just watch your back. And hers too, I suppose." They finished the bottle as the night deepened, speaking of lighter things, memories of shared boyhood adventures, cattle drives and better years, the new stallion Everett had acquired just before the drought hit. Neither mentioned the wedding again, but it sat between them like a third presence in the room, unavoidable and demanding. When Daniel finally left, clasping Everett's shoulder with a grip that conveyed more than words could, the silence of the house settled over Everett like a physical weight. He moved to the window, looking out at his land bathed in moonlight. The rolling pastures, the distant line of cottonwoods marking the creek, the weathered barn, all of it was worth fighting for. Worth marrying for. He just hoped the price wouldn't prove higher than he'd calculated. Sleep came fitfully, dreams of faceless brides and contracts written in blood chasing him through the night. He woke before dawn, the gray light barely creeping over the horizon as he dressed with methodical precision. The suit had been his father's, worn only twice, at his wedding and his funeral. Everett had it taken in by the widow Parker in town, but it still hung awkwardly on his frame, a costume rather than clothing. The church bell tolled a somber cadence as Everett stood at the front of the small chapel that morning. The pews held only a handful of people. Daniel, positioned near the back as if ready to stage a rescue. Mayor Hollister, whose perpetually worried expression seemed especially pronounced today. The bank manager, Simmons, whose calculating eyes assessed Everett as if still determining his investment potential. A few townsfolk whose curiosity had overcome their respect for privacy. The emptiness echoed louder than any crowd. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting fragments of color across the worn wooden floor. The scent of old hymnals and fresh-cut wildflowers mingled in the still air. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling around the eaves like a distant warning. Everett's throat tightened beneath his finally conquered tie. The bank manager caught his eye and offered a slight nod of approval. The arrangement had bought Everett time, a 6-month reprieve on his loans. The price was standing here, waiting to bind himself to a stranger. The side door opened, and Sheriff Grant appeared, his formal black suit a stark contrast to his usual dusty uniform. His face was unreadable, eyes hard as flint beneath the brim of his hat. He gave Everett a curt nod before taking his place by the door through which his daughter would enter. The piano began, a halting rendition of the wedding march played by Miss Collins, the schoolteacher whose arthritis made the notes waver like uncertain promises. The main doors swung open. Everett's first glimpse of Alice Grant stole the breath from his lungs. She was slender, wrapped in a simple cream dress that seemed to float around her like morning mist. Her face was half hidden behind a thin veil, but he could make out delicate features, pale skin, and hair the color of wheat under moonlight. There was no disfigurement, no visible reason for her seclusion that he could discern. But it was the way she moved that struck him most, measured steps, deliberate and precise, her hand resting on her father's arm with what appeared to be reluctance. Her entire body seemed coiled, like a spring holding potential energy. Not the cowering posture he might have expected from someone hidden away from the world, but something else entirely. As she drew closer, Everett could feel the weight of her gaze through the veil. She was assessing him, just as he was her. He wondered what she saw, a desperate man selling himself to save his birthright? A stranger to whom she was being handed like property? Sheriff Grant delivered her to the altar with military precision, placing her hand in Everett's before stepping back. Her fingers were cool against his palm, but steady, with none of the trembling he had anticipated. Up close, he could see her eyes now, startling in their clarity, a deep green that reminded him of the lake in the high country after spring thaw. They held not fear or confusion, as the rumors might have suggested, but something that twisted his insides with unexpected force. Intelligence, awareness, and something else he couldn't quite name, a spark of what almost seemed like anticipation. The preacher cleared his throat and began the ceremony. The words washed over Everett like water over stone, barely registering as he tried to reconcile the rumors with the woman beside him. Why had she been hidden away? What secret could possibly justify such isolation when she appeared neither simple-minded nor disfigured? Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses. Through the thin material of her glove, he could feel the firm structure of her hand, not the soft, uncalloused fingers of someone who had never worked, but a hand that knew purpose. It contradicted everything he had been led to believe. To join this man and this woman in holy matrimony, which is an honorable estate. A slight movement caught his attention. Alice had turned her head, just a fraction, to survey the assembled witnesses. The motion was quick, assessing, almost strategic. Not the behavior of someone fearful or confused by their surroundings. If any person can show just cause why they may not be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The traditional pause stretched longer than usual, filled only by the sound of the wind outside and the collective breath of the onlookers. Everett felt Alice's hand shift in his, a deliberate repositioning. I have cause. Her voice sliced through the silence, clear and unwavering. The first words he had ever heard from her lips. The congregation froze. The sheriff stiffened, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip where his gun would normally rest. Alice turned to face the assembled witnesses, pulling her hand from Everett's grasp. With deliberate slowness, she reached up and lifted the veil away from her face. The features revealed were striking, high cheekbones, a straight nose, lips curved in what could almost be amusement. No trace of fear or timidity, no sign of mental simplicity. Instead, her expression held the collected calm of someone executing a long-planned strategy. I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of this arrangement, she said, her voice rich and steady, carrying easily to the back of the small church. One I feel compelled to clarify before proceeding. The sheriff stepped forward, his face darkening. Alice. She turned toward him, one hand raised in a gesture that was not pleading but commanding. Remarkably, he stopped. My name is indeed Alice Grant, she continued, addressing the congregation rather than her father or Everett. And contrary to the rumors that I know have circulated through Whitebrook for years, I am neither simple-minded, nor disfigured, nor morally deficient. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd. Everett stood motionless, caught between confusion and a growing sense that he had walked into something far more complex than a simple marriage of convenience. I have remained at my father's home by choice, Alice continued, her voice taking on a tone of wry amusement. a choice that served both his purposes and my own. She turned to Everett now, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. The intelligence there was unmistakable, sharp and assessing. "Mr. Hayes, you agreed to marry me under certain false pretenses. Not of your making, I understand, but false nonetheless. Before I decide whether to proceed, I believe you deserve the truth." The sheriff moved again, more urgently this time. "This isn't the place." "It's precisely the place," Alice cut him off, her tone pleasant but unyielding. "We're better than before God and these witnesses?" She turned back to Everett, something softening in her expression. "My father has told you, I presume, that I am a burden requiring care? A poor, sheltered creature unable to face the world." Everett managed a nod, finding his voice. "Something to that effect." A smile touched her lips, transforming her face. "How diplomatic of you. The truth, Mr. Hayes, is rather different. I am my father's accountant, his secretary, and for the past 10 years, the architect of most of his business dealings." The revelation sent another wave of murmurs through the church. Mayor Hollister sat up straighter, his expression sharpening with interest. "My seclusion began as his overprotection after my mother's death, yes, but it evolved into something more, mutually beneficial." She glanced at her father, whose face had settled into a mask of resignation. "I discovered early on that I had a facility with numbers, with contracts, with the intricacies of business that my father lacked. While he managed the public face of his affairs, I managed the substance." She turned back to the congregation, her voice taking on a harder edge. "I also discovered that men speak more freely when they believe no one of consequence is listening. My father's study shares a wall with our parlor, where he would entertain his associates. Hidden away, presumed simple or absent, I heard everything. Every scheme, every secret, every vulnerability." The bank manager shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The mayor's face had gone pale. "Together, we built something substantial. His position, his authority, backed by my understanding of how to convert that authority into wealth and influence. A partnership that has served us both well." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "But partnerships evolve. Circumstances change." She turned back to Everett, studying him with those clear green eyes. "Which brings us to you, Mr. Hayes, in this arrangement. My father has not been entirely forthcoming about his motivations." The sheriff finally found his voice. "That's enough, Alice." She ignored him. "Your ranch, Mr. Hayes, sits on land that has recently become extraordinarily valuable, not for its cattle or crops, but for what lies beneath it." Everett's brow furrowed. "There's nothing beneath it but rock and poor soil." "There's coal," she said simply. "A significant deposit, according to the geological survey conducted quietly last spring. A survey commissioned by certain interests from back east, interests my father has been cultivating." The revelation hit Everett like a physical blow. Coal. The lifeblood of the railways, of industry, of progress pushing ever westward. If true, it would explain much: the persistent offers from the Harrington outfit, the increased tax assessments, the reluctance of the bank to work with him despite his family's long history with them. "The arrangement my father proposed was designed to keep you on the land, working it as before, while he secured the mineral rights through our marriage. A controlling interest, with none of the mess of trying to force you off your property." Her eyes held a mixture of admiration and apology. "It was elegantly done, I must admit. My idea, originally, though the execution was his." The sheriff's face had gone from pale to flushed, his hands clenched at his sides. "You've said more than enough." "I've said hardly anything yet," she replied, a spark of genuine irritation flashing in her eyes. "For instance, I haven't mentioned your arrangement with the Railway Commission, or your partnership with the Harrington family, or the rather creative bookkeeping in the county records." The mayor stood abruptly. "Is this true, Grant?" The sheriff's gaze darted around the room, calculating his position. Daniel had moved closer to the front, his hand resting near his belt where Everett knew he carried a small derringer. "My daughter is unwell," the sheriff said, his voice controlled but tight. "This outburst is precisely why she has been kept from public view. Her mind creates fancies, conspiracies." "My mind creates profit," Alice corrected, still perfectly calm. "As your accounts will attest." She turned to address the room again. "I have copies of everything. Every contract, every letter, every figure. Secured with a trusted party to be released should anything unfortunate happen to me." The subtle threat hung in the air. The sheriff's shoulders sagged slightly, defeat washing over his features as he recognized the corner he'd been backed into. Alice turned back to Everett, something almost apologetic in her expression now. "I do apologize for the deception, Mr. Hayes. You were a means to an end, a way for me to finally extricate myself from arrangements that have become restrictive. Everett found his voice at last. Why tell me this now? Why not simply go through with the wedding and continue as before? She studied him, head tilted slightly. Because you seem like a decent man. And because I have my own ambitions that no longer align with remaining hidden away. A smile touched her lips again. Also, marriage should involve at least a modicum of honesty, don't you think? The church had grown uncomfortably quiet, the witnesses watching the drama unfold with a mixture of shock and fascination. The sheriff stood rigid, his authority visibly crumbling in the face of his daughter's revelations. What happens now? Everett asked quietly. Alice considered him for a long moment. That depends on you, Mr. Hayes. The fact remains that your ranch needs capital to survive. The fact also remains that there is coal beneath your land that could make you a wealthy man, if properly managed. She paused, her gaze direct and challenging. And the fact remains that I am seeking a new arrangement, one that allows me to step out of the shadows and into a role more befitting my abilities. Understanding dawned slowly. You still want to marry me? I propose a partnership, she corrected. One with clear terms, mutual benefit, and no illusions. Your land. My business acumen. A venture that could benefit us both substantially. Her eyes held his, unflinching. And yes, marriage would be the most efficient way to structure such a partnership, legally speaking. Everett felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He had come expecting to marry a simpleton, a burden, a secret to be kept. Instead, he was being offered a partner. A shrewd, calculating partner, yes, but one who had just demonstrated her value rather convincingly. And your father? He asked, glancing at the sheriff, who watched them with barely contained fury. Will cause no trouble, she said with certainty. He has too much to lose. And I believe the mayor and Mr. Simmons might have some questions for him regarding certain county matters. She smiled at the two men, who nodded slowly, the implications clear. Everett looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the intelligence in those green eyes, the confidence in her posture, the subtle challenge in her expression. She was not what he had expected. Not a victim to be saved, not a burden to be carried. Instead, she was offering him something he had never considered, a true partnership, based on mutual need and clear-eyed assessment. I need to think, he said finally. She nodded, respect showing in her eyes. A reasonable request. But the minister is here, the witnesses are gathered, and there are certain advantages to proceeding today. She glanced meaningfully at her father. Momentum has its own power. Daniel caught Everett's eye from the side of the church, raising an eyebrow in silent question. Everett gave a small nod, a signal that he was all right, that he was making this choice with open eyes. He turned back to Alice. A partnership. Equal say in decisions. Honest dealings between us. I would expect nothing less, she agreed. And in return, you get capital for your ranch, protection of your interests, and a wife who brings rather more to the arrangement than domestic skills. The corner of her mouth quirked up. Though I can manage those as well, if required. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Everett thought of his land, of the generations of Hayes' blood and sweat soaked into the soil. He thought of coal, of wealth beyond the uncertain fortunes of cattle ranching. And he thought of the woman before him, who had orchestrated this entire scenario with precision and daring. Reverend, he said, not taking his eyes from Alice's, I believe we were in the middle of a ceremony. A visible ripple of surprise moved through the congregation. The sheriff's face darkened further, but he remained silent, outmaneuvered by his own daughter. Alice's smile widened, genuine pleasure lighting her eyes. A wise decision, Mr. Hayes. Everett, he corrected. Everett, she echoed, taking his hand again, her grip firmer now, more certain. I believe we'll work well together. The Reverend cleared his throat, visibly flustered by the unprecedented turn of events. Shall we continue then? Please do, Alice said, turning to face the altar once more. Though perhaps we might skip ahead to the vows. I believe we've covered the objections quite thoroughly. A nervous laugh rippled through the congregation. Even Daniel was smiling now, shaking his head in amazement. As the Reverend resumed the ceremony, Everett felt the weight on his chest shift and transform. The stone in his boot had become something else, not a burden, but a foundation. He had come seeking a financial arrangement and found instead a partner who might match him stride for stride. It was not the marriage he had imagined, not the future he had planned. It might be better. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, simple bands that the sheriff had provided, now weighted with meanings neither he nor Everett had anticipated. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Alice turned to Everett with a look of such clear-eyed purpose that he felt, for the first time in months, a surge of genuine hope. "Well, husband," she said quietly as they turned to face the congregation, "shall we begin?" The sunlight through the stained glass caught her face, illuminating features now animated with intelligence and resolve. Everett offered his arm, which she took with confident grace. "Lead the way," he said, and together they stepped into a future neither of them could have predicted, one shaped not by desperation and secrecy, but by a partnership forged in the momentary honesty of a woman who had decided it was time to step from the shadows into the light. As they reached the doors of the church, the Montana wind greeted them, carrying the scent of sage and open prairie. Alice paused, lifting her face to it as if greeting an old friend. "I've watched this land from windows for 17 years, she said softly. "It will be good to feel it underfoot at last." Everett glanced back at the sheriff, still standing by the altar, his authority diminished but not destroyed. A dangerous man, made more dangerous by humiliation. "He'll be trouble," Everett murmured. Alice followed his gaze, her expression hardening briefly before softening into something almost like pity. "Less than you might think. His power has always rested on perception, on what people believe about him." She squeezed his arm gently. "And perceptions have shifted today." Outside, their future waited, the ranch with its hidden wealth, the town with its shifting allegiances, the vast Montana sky stretching endless above them. Not the marriage either had expected, but perhaps the one they both needed. "Shall we?" Everett asked, gesturing toward the waiting buggy that would take them home. Alice nodded, her eyes bright with anticipation of challenges to come. "We shall." Together they stepped into the sunlight, leaving behind the shadows of secrets and entering a partnership forged in the unexpected truth of a bride's first words at the altar, words that had, indeed, changed everything.
I hope you enjoyed this thrilling journey. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this story? Let me know in the comments below. Your feedback inspires more epic tales.